Hey everyone, welcome to the Collingwood Cymbals Patreon page. I hope you're all doing great. For today's video, we're going to be diving deeper into some of the practical and psychological reasons why people actually like vintage cymbals and old things in general, especially in our generation. So with that said, just have to say that I'm not a psychologist or anything like that. These are just some observations in life that I've made and done a little bit of research into some of these topics. So please, if you hear something that doesn't sound right to you, let's start that conversation in the comments as always. So let's get started. So let's start off by talking about the cymbals themselves. When people talk about vintage cymbals, they're usually talking about old Ks, Zildjians from Istanbul, but there are plenty of other types that follow a lot of the same rules, like old As, Paiste Formula 602s, old China and trap cymbals from Wuhan, Canadian Ks from the early days before Sabian, and plenty more after that. So for the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to stick mostly to Turkish Ks, since they seem to have the most debate, mystique, and historical significance around them. So the first question that we usually find ourselves asking is, does the age of the cymbal actually matter for the sound itself? Yes, it does. The dust and moisture, and especially the sulfur content in the atmosphere and in our sweat, is going to react with the surface of the cymbal, with the bronze, and that creates a thin layer of oxidation over time. And that patina is what darkens the color. It restricts the vibration, which kind of squishes the frequency range of the cymbal. And it's going to mellow out the wash. This, paired with the extra stick definition you get from the decades of vibration, which slowly and microscopically work harden the metal, is part of why people say there's no substitute for age, and they would be right in saying that. This all makes the cymbal a little bit more brittle over time as well, which is why cymbal smiths, such as myself and all the others, are always extra cautious when people ask us to modify and work on these types of older cymbals. One of the first misconceptions that people tend to have about old Ks is that they're kind of like a cymbal line or a series that share qualities with each other, and that's just not the case. They're all pretty much completely individual pieces that share the place they were born and some of the manufacturing process, but that's about it. They were all made in the factory with wildly different weighted blanks. They had the bells punched into them, stacked together multiple cymbals at a time while they were still hot, just by a guy swinging a sledgehammer. So a lot of the bells are kind of differently shaped and irregularly shaped. Some of them are a lot smaller and bigger and differently shaped. And one of the biggest aspects is, depending on the decade, year, month, week, or even day that they were made, they're going to be hammered and lathed by totally different people, which is a big contributing factor in giving each cymbal its own sound. As Paul Francis has said many times in various podcasts and stuff like that, which is an interesting thought, is that these guys didn't have a drumstick in their back pocket, kind of similar to how we think of cymbal testers today. They were so good at what they did that they would hammer and lathe out a cymbal, they'd pick it up, look at it, and say, yep, that's good, and off it went. John Riley has talked about this idea as well, where drum shops back in the day would receive big crates from Turkey of the old Ks, and let's say you had 50 of them, you would pull them out and test them, and probably over half of them would sound bad to you, but the ones that sounded good were lifelong partners. So that leads into dispelling another myth, which is the idea of what people would call the Holy Grail cymbal. And not just, it's that idea. I don't want to go so far as to say that it doesn't exist, but it's not as simple as what we think it would be. So, for example, people will hear the words 22-inch old K, and that automatically associates in their mind with Tony, which is, it's too much of a stretch. So if we take 4 and More as an example, the Miles Davis album that most people associate with that great Tony Williams ride cymbal sound, people will think that it's his cymbal specifically that is creating that sound, when in reality it's his cymbal played by his hands and his sticks in that auditorium mixed with the other band members, going into those mics, which are placed a certain distance away, into preamps and equipment, then grooved into the wax, and then digitally recreated over the next half century. That is his cymbal sound. So it's never quite as simple as just that cymbal being that sound. People tend to be pretty baffled when they see and hear, Tony's actual ride cymbal, because it sounds basically nothing like the records. There's little hints of, what sound like what you would hear on the records, but it's vastly, vastly different, and the context is really important. And speaking of context, it isn't just the cymbal itself or the way it was recorded. You and your ears provide context as well. Everybody's heard the saying, you are what you eat. In this case, you are what you listen to. So people who grew up listening to metal, for example, will probably hear like a super heavy mega bell ride as their holy grail, while somebody who specializes in jazz piano trios might hear an old Peisty flat ride, the Roy Haynes kind of sound, and think the same thing, that holy grail sound, for a polar opposite sound. So which one is actually the holy grail? That's what I was getting at before, where it's not as simple as, there being a holy grail sound. So in the context of vintage cymbals, they're usually associated with the time period where jazz was king. So if you're a modern metal player, the idea of an expensive, old, dirty cymbal that Philly Joe Jones played is probably not going to be as important to you as someone who has a musical identity that's more associated with that era. But whether it's your thing or not, the reason these cymbals are valuable is because of their historical and cultural significance and the handmade quality in a world that's dominated by mass production that we live in now. So you may not personally like Picasso's paintings, but to deny their value based on your own taste is kind of missing the point. And the same rules apply here. So here's where it's going to get a little bit dense. I want you to stay with me. It's going to get a little abstract. But moving into the psychology and kind of nostalgia factor, the simplest reason why our generation tends to look backwards more than others did is because we have access to information that other people just never had because of the internet. So for the first time in history, people have been able to embody their style and interests in any era that they want, which can be a cool thing in my opinion. It gives people a much wider array within which they can express themselves, and that's pretty cool. But the other side of that coin is social media and how people, myself included to an extent, believe that all this access to information has somewhat cheapened the life that we're supposed to be leading in the moment. So rather than doing things for the sake of doing them and to progress our own character as human beings, we tend to do things as quickly, as easy as possible for the sake of clicks and likes. And this causes people to romanticize the past a little bit, where life was a little bit slower and more difficult, but it was ultimately more rewarding and fulfilling. And that idea brings something to mind that I heard a while ago that resonated with me, and I looked it up, but I can't remember who said it. But there's evidence to support that before the kind of philosophical idea of the self became really prominent in our culture, people thought of their own lives very differently than they do today. We tend to think of ourselves as wholly individual in modern times, whereas people in the past may have thought of themselves as something like a single unit of continuity within a greater whole of what we would call the constant reality of human life. So this idea, paired with the slower technological innovations and the pace of life in that time, made it easier for people in the past to find fulfillment in their life in the here and now of what they were doing. Contrary to that, the super fast pace and oversaturation of information paired with modern philosophies that we have gives people the ability to find their identity anywhere they want, which comes with both good and bad aspects. But a lot of younger people, millennials and kind of my generation and beyond, will report that they have feelings of general emptiness in their lives. And when you glue all of these ideas together, you have what I think is a perfect formula for kind of a fascination and longing for the past and the mystique therein. So just as an example, think of this. The first commercial steam engine was invented around 1698, based on my research. I'm sure there's some variation to that. But the first patent on the gas engine, which is a variation of the same technology, came around in 1794, which is almost 100 years later. Compare that to now. About 40 years ago, the internet didn't even exist, and now the internet is able to use AI to computer generate pop stars that have their own, fake appearance, and they're able to sing and write their own songs and post on platforms that can stream music and videos at the click of a button anywhere in the world. That right there is a huge uptake in the pace of technological advancement. So when I think of that, that makes sense to me why people in the past thought of their lives as being more constant. They could have multiple generations, 3, 4, 5 generations back, teaching them about how things are. Whereas we, in this generation, have our own dads who are constantly telling us about how things used to be and that nothing is the same. Okay, thanks for sticking with me through that, those of you who did. This final segment is a little bit more self-evident and easier to swallow, I promise. The last big reason for the value and perception of old Ks specifically is just in the nature of mass production. Mass production reduces value. It's as simple as that. Old As and old Ks from Zildjian are, they're produced in the same era largely, from the same company, and they're often played on records, by the same people. But one of them is worth $200, and one of them is worth $2,000. People value handmade craftsmanship more than machine-made things almost universally. What those two things do have in common is that they have kind of an objective, timeless quality which isn't present in many modern trends. Lots of modern businesses are born and die with trends in the industry. They'll pursue them as quickly and cheaply as possible without thinking about quality control and reliability, and that is contrary to vintage cymbals, which by definition have stood the test of time, and that separates them from the kind of sour taste that a huge corporation chasing the latest trend can leave in your mouth. So, in conclusion, all of that is kind of a long-winded way of saying, if the shoe fits, wear it. If the cymbal sounds good to you and it accomplishes what you need it to do, then by definition, it's a good cymbal. Whether you personally agree with the way the market has gone or not, you can still appreciate the history and cultural significance of these old pieces of art that we call vintage cymbals. So thanks everybody for watching this video, and happy shedding.